We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Palestinian political activist Mahmoud Khalil, a recent graduate of Columbia University, is charged with no crime. And yet today he sits in a U.S. prison, an ICE detention center. Why? Because of his political views. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Layan Sima Fuleihan. She is a popular educator. She's the education director at the People's Forum. She's an organizer with Shut It Down for Palestine. And she has been one of the key organizers mobilizing mass support for Mahmoud Khalil. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on the show, Brian.
Well, this is an epic battle. We're recording on Wednesday. I mean, just a few hours ago, thousands of people were down at Foley Square outside the federal court where Mahmoud's lawyers were trying to get him free from an ICE detention center in Louisiana. They did not succeed. There is going to be a legal process, however. Anyway, thousands of people were there. This is an epic battle. I think people around the country actually recognize it for what it is. Something that's not just about the case of one individual, but the outcome will impact society at large. Let's talk about it.
Well, Brian, that's a great place to start because I think that's the most important development so far. The Trump administration clearly tried to single out Mahmoud Khalil in order to scare people, other people, from coming out and protesting and exercising their right to political speech. Instead of scaring people, he was arrested on Saturday night. By Monday, there were thousands, nearly 10,000 people were in the streets protesting for his release, for his right to be with his family, for him to be returned from Louisiana and brought back to New York City and released immediately, for ICE to be off the campuses. Then, since then, every single day, there have been mass protests. Today, in the middle of the day, people waited outside the courthouse for hours, high energy, rallying and demanding his release. Instead of scaring the movement, this has actually brought the movement to grow stronger, to grow broader, and people are coming out with high confidence that this is something that we need to see happen right now. These demands are backed by the majority of people in this country.
Well, we were both at the demonstration. We were at the one called on Monday, demonstrations on Tuesday, today when the lawyers were in court. What was noteworthy in my mind was that the diversity of the protesters. I mean, it was young people, it was old people, it was Palestinians, it was non-Palestinians. It was celebrities like Susan Sarandon. I mean, people across the board are coming to his support. One of the things that was noteworthy about the Monday demonstration, which you helped organize, the People's Forum, Answer Coalition, the Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition, Palestinian Youth Movement, an assortment of organizations did this. Several thousand people came out, but it got immensely positive coverage from the New York Times. Now, the New York Times, just for our audience, they've been aware of demonstrations in support of the people of Gaza against the genocide. For a long time, we've been going to the New York Times front door and protesting and accusing the New York Times of lying about the Gaza genocide. But this coverage is very, very favorable. I want to get your take on it because it seemed to me that there's kind of a turn, a shift happening politically, even in some sectors of the political establishment who have been normally quite hostile to the Palestine Solidarity Movement. What do you think?
That was a major development. I did a lot of interviews over the past couple of days at these protests with generally bourgeois media, capitalist media that hasn't been, when they come and cover the protests, they usually say, they usually very much minimize the number of people who've come out in the streets. When they ask you questions, they're usually relatively hostile.
Yeah, the New York Times was using the language that Manhattan was flooded with demonstrators. Yes. I mean, this is carefully crafted language by the mainstream media. They know exactly what they want to do. I mean, we've had demonstrations of 50,000 people in the last year in Manhattan, the New York Times didn't use that kind of language.
Yeah, they would say, oh, maybe a couple hundred came out when we would have 50,000 people on the streets. When they would come interview you, they would say, well, how, do you support Hamas or not?
Yeah.
And they start off with these kind of aggressive questions already coming from another place. These past few days, completely different. I even had one interview with a major news corporation, and at the end of the interview, which was very friendly, they were really, asking me, why are you here? What are your demands? Giving us a voice, giving us some time to really clearly explain why we're there, which they usually don't do. And after the interview, they cut the recording and they said, listen, we can't say this on air, but this is despicable. And as journalists, we are horrified by what is happening. We can't say this on air because of our bosses, but we are with you. This is major corporations.
Yeah, I think there's two reasons for this. One is this case is unlike any case in recent time. I mean, people have been deported before. People have lost their jobs before. But Mahmoud was like a principal voice, well-known voice in the encampment protests. He was a negotiator with Columbia University. Everybody kind of was aware of him. He's also a green card holder, which means he has a legal status here, and it also means the First Amendment applies to him. He has the right to speak out. He wasn't under any criminal charges. The DHS officials who came to his apartment, his campus housing on Saturday night, where he and his wife, who's 8 months pregnant, were living, they opened the door. One of them opened the door, so they charged in. They said, you're under arrest, we're gonna deport you. His wife showed them his green card, and the DHS official, who, by the way, one of them at least was an honored guest of Donald Trump at an earlier State of the Union address, so a high-level person, a chum of Donald Trump, made a phone call and said, oh, look, he's got a green card. And then the person on the other end of the call said, okay, well, that's revoked too. That's revoked too. So I think a lot of people realize that if Donald Trump can arrest people who have legal status in the country, who have a green card, or beyond people own green cards, if you're a U.S. citizen, if you can be arrested because of what you said, what you thought, who you were, your expression of free speech rights, then the whole idea of the First Amendment is out the window. So that's why I think a lot of people are railing to Mahmoud's case. The second reason is that people, including within elite circles, are looking for a way to fight against Trump's policies. Now, this is important because in historical processes, inter-elite conflicts are often a precursor to a larger societal crisis. It's not simply a struggle between the working class and the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. There are conflicts within the ruling class. And I think the favorable media coverage is also, in addition to the fact that it's a grotesque case, in an obviously grotesque case, I think there are sectors of the ruling class who want to be against Trump, but having seen the Democratic Party establishment completely fall on their face, completely retreat, have a craven sort of expression of sort of passivity in the face of Trump's very aggressive policies, people are, even within elite politics, seeing this as a possible way to fight. And now, I want to play a clip. It's from the White House press secretary. She's talking to responding to a journalist, and the journalist saying he's not accused of a crime, and he's not on a visa. He has legal status. How can you possibly put him in an ICE detention center? How can you kidnap him from his home? Listen to her response.
Here on Mahmoud Khalil. Does the administration believe that it needs to charge a green card holder with a crime to be eligible for deportation?
Well, in fact, Secretary Rubio reserves the right to revoke the visa of Mahmoud Khalil, and I'm glad you brought this up. Under the Immigration and Nationality Act, the Secretary of State has the right to revoke a green card or a visa for individuals who serve or are adversarial to the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States of America. And
So I think she was confused. She kept using visa and green card interchangeably. But her point is Marco Rubio has the right to, put him in jail and then deport him because he represents a threat to America's foreign policy. In what possible way? I mean, does this mean if you oppose the war, say the Israeli genocide in Gaza, you're against American foreign policy and thus you have no rights? Does it mean, for instance, 60 years ago, if you were against the Vietnam War, when people yelled, "Go back to Russia, you don't support our government," that you actually should have been able to be arrested? Anyway, this is how grotesque this case is.
It's completely thuggish behavior. Let's just actually do a play-by-play of what happened because it's absolutely absurd and outrageous. Marco Rubio gives the order, which we found out confirmed by the White House, that it was Marco Rubio that signed off on the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil.
And he's a puppet of Donald Trump.
He's a puppet of Donald Trump. Now, where did Marco Rubio get Mahmoud's name? There's a group that's claimed responsibility for that, Betar USA, an extremist Zionist group that is in their entire existence is inside the United States. They go after pro-Palestinian activists and they harass them. They actually even sometimes provoke violent conflicts at protests. That's their entire existence. They just threaten and harass pro-Palestinian activists. They submitted a list of names of pro-Palestinian organizers on campus, 20 faculty and 100 students. They said these are people they've identified as foreign students that need to be deported because of their political activity. They called them pro-Hamas agents, and they submitted that to the White House some weeks ago. Now, they are the ones who said that Mahmoud Khalil has a student visa. Then on Saturday night...
Wait a second. Let's be clear. So this right-wing, extreme right-wing Zionist group, they were targeting individual students.
Yes.
They were the ones who said he's got a visa. In other words, they didn't know he was on a green card.
They don't know because they are not a federal agency. They said he's on a student visa and they sent this list into the White House. Now, we don't know exactly what happened inside the White House, how they decided, if they did any of their own research. But on Saturday night, DHS shows up at Mahmoud's apartment, and Elvin Hernandez, which is the DHS officer that you talked about, he was honored at Trump's 2019 State of the Union address. He shows up. He says, we're arresting you. Mahmoud is on the phone with his lawyer, and Elvin Hernandez takes the phone from Mahmoud and talks to his lawyer and says to his lawyer, "We are going to revoke his student visa." His lawyer responds, "He doesn't have a student visa. He has a green card." Elvin says, "We're going to revoke that too." And they arrest him.
So the DHS seems like, we can't prove it, but it seems like they got their information about who should be targeted with wrong information about whether they're green card holders or visa from this right-wing Zionist group that's obviously been doxing and targeting Palestinian activists.
And the thing here that really matters is not whether Mahmoud has a student visa or a green card, because in either situation, he should not be arrested or deported for his political activity for criticizing the foreign policy of the United States. This is totally absurd. But it just shows how top down this whole process is. This was completely out of regular procedure. Eric Adams said to the press over the weekend, he said that basically there's nothing he can do about it because this is just federal activity. It's federal jurisdiction. Columbia University really said that they haven't said anything. They basically said that ICE can come onto campus if there's a warrant, but they refuse to acknowledge whether or not there was a warrant for Mahmoud. Everyone's kind of pretending that their hands are tied. And then here comes Marco Rubio just saying, let's just get him and let's make an example out of him. Trump tweeted about him. He had this horrific, the White House put out a horrific tweet there. He said, Shalom Mahmoud. Just like a few days ago, they said, Shalom Hamas. They've been doing this kind of grotesque behavior.
Taunting,
totally taunting language. And also, it's just even the Israeli media is concerned about how the United States White House right now is using Hebrew words to kind of characterize their own abuse of power here. It's a horrific development from the White House, and it's something that even the Democrats now are moved to say something. But I want to say something about that, Brian, because, like you said, the Democrats have insisted that the only thing they can do right now is wait. I mean, they haven't lifted a finger to protect anyone from the Trump-Musk policies that have been already wreaking havoc on the lives of everyday people, firing masses of workers, cutting union contracts left and right, just coming in swinging hard and swinging heavy, and the Democrats have decided, no, we're not going to do anything. Well, the mass movement came out for Mahmoud. The mass movement in its broadest representation. Everyone came out. People who come from different social justice struggles have all come out. Everyone sees themselves reflected in the stakes that are on the table here. What happens to Mahmoud affects everyone's future. And so everyone has come out. And that has opened the door, I think, for some of the Democrats to then say, okay, well, maybe we should say something. I mean, some of these Democratic senators and Democratic voices did nothing when the genocide was going on, in fact, cheered it on. But now they're facing a Trump administration that goes completely against all the things that they even would want to see happen, and they've been left hopeless. The mass movement has shown them what to do, has kind of opened the opportunity for it. It's something that I think we should investigate and understand a little bit more, because it really has the ability to change how the correlation of forces on the table here, and to make some actions occur that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yeah, this raises some important questions for our movement. We are the socialist program, so we're an avowedly, explicitly socialist program. We're helping and trying to help build a socialist movement in the United States. How do we think about conflicts within the elite sectors of society, within the capitalist ruling class? I think the most important thing is, one, not to become the tail to any faction of the ruling class, to have complete independence, to realize that the salvation, the end of war, for instance, or occupation, or racism, or colonialism, it means societal, revolutionary, radical transformation, not trying to tie our movement to the lesser evil sector of the ruling class. So we don't want to do that. At the same time, we don't want to ignore the fact that inter-elite conflicts sometimes open space for a larger intervention from the masses of people who are against the entire system, or want to end war entirely, or colonialism, or in this case, the occupation over historic Palestine. Now, in 1969, I was a young teenager. I was organizing the moratorium protests, buses to go to Washington, D.C. moratorium in November 1969. The week before the protest, which turned out to be the biggest anti-war protest, maybe the biggest protest ever in U.S. history up until that time, we had 3 buses going. I was part of this little youth ministry in Rochester, New York. We had 3 buses. We were very proud that we had gotten more than 100 people to come on the bus with us. And then suddenly, on Monday night, Tuesday, Wednesday, the mainstream media, NBC, CBS, started talking about this great moratorium was coming. People were going to Washington to protest against the war in Vietnam. Suddenly, like we were the cat's meow. It was kind of like, all right, this is cool. And within a couple days, we had 20 buses, because the mainstream capitalist-owned media started talking about the protest movement. Why did they do that? Because there was a split in the U.S. ruling class, where one sector of the ruling class had determined the war in Vietnam was unwinnable, that it was going to cost America more to keep fighting rather than to withdraw. And so they started to promote the movement. That's the power of the capitalist media. Again, we see fracturing within inter-elite circles right now over the Trump administration's very aggressive right-wing extremist positions, trying to change the form of governance. And Mahmoud's case is in some ways being used to channel some of this inter-elite conflict. Again, we don't want to become the tail to the kite of any faction of the ruling class, but it would be silly on the part of the left to not take cognizance of the fact that this creates some space. Again, I think this is what's happening. Look at what's happening at the Tesla dealerships all over the country. The scientists are out in the streets. Scientists generally don't protest. They're in the streets right now. There's another women's march called for April 5th. the immigration rights movement and immigration support apparatuses are being created around the country. It hasn't congealed yet into a big, broad offensive. And when it does, we want to make sure that we're not following the Democratic Party, which, as you pointed out, facilitated the genocide, carried out all kinds of repression against Palestinian, not just Palestinian students, but against all the students who were protesting in support of Palestine or against the genocide in Gaza. Anyway, we have to think about this with its political complexity and not be sort of one-dimensional kind of activists or organizers who don't really appreciate the sort of complex political struggle that's unfolding.
And I think it's also so important, alongside what you've just raised, Brian, is also to think about what the Trump administration was trying to do here. We opened with this, but I think it's important to return to in this conversation. The Trump administration has already failed. They wanted to deport Mahmoud in order to scare everyone. They've already failed, and they haven't yet deported Mahmoud. And they may fail in that too, and it's very likely that they will, and I hope they do. But what they've done has actually backfired. They thought that, like anyone who puts out a witch hunt, it's a classic witch hunt. The witch hunt is intended to make example of a few people in order to get everyone else to abide by a new reality, a new regime, a new new conditions of how people behave. Well, they tried this. They isolated Mahmoud. They focused in on Mahmoud. They said more are coming in the weeks leading up to this moment. We all knew that something was happening because the Department of Justice sent people to 10 universities across the country. They had been making many aggressive comments publicly on social media, to the Israeli media even. Leo Terrell, who was overseeing the anti-Semitism task force that was just newly created, he went on Israeli media and he said, we intend to put these students away for many years, not just 24 hours. I mean, really aggressive threats. This was the climate in which Mahmoud's high-profile arrest occurred. Trump clearly wanted this to be high-profile, otherwise he wouldn't be tweeting about it. Marco Rubio wouldn't be talking about it.
Trump is tweeting about it himself.
Yes, exactly. So their plan was to make this high profile. It's totally backfired already because people are not just protesting in New York, where Mahmoud is known and loved and recognizable. People are protesting across the country. There have been protests in D.C. There have been protests in California. There have been protests across the U.S. South. People from not just the student movement, not just the Palestine movement, not just the immigrant rights movement. People from all walks of life are coming out. It's unifying people rather than isolating, dividing, and scaring people. I really think we need to emphasize that the White House has already failed in their mission with Mahmoud's arrest.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, they said this is the first of many to come, right? Now, we know, Layan, because we're in touch with the movement in the streets and the movement on the college campuses, a lot of students are worried. The students who are here on visas, who participated at all in protests of any type, they're worried right now. Even if they actually didn't protest, but they just posted on social media, they're worried. It's natural. It's understandable. You have the full weight of the government, seemingly, with the Trump administration's pledge to, basically deport people, end their education and deport them, seize them, put them in ICE detention facilities and then deport them because they stood up against a genocide. So people are nervous and scared to some extent. That's why fighting back and winning is so important, because if everybody retreats, then they win. The repressive, suppressive state apparatus wins. If people fight back and if we show we can win, even a small victories tend to build upon themselves. And I think that's what's so encouraging about this moment. And again, the spineless Democrats, well, they're not just spineless, they're imperialist, an imperialist party. They were all about suppressing the students in the encampments. And Cornell University, this was during the Biden administration, a PhD graduate student and also a professor there, was terminated because they saw him at an encampment. Cornell saw him. And so the Democratic Party did nothing for these people except add on to the repression. But now the fight back has started on a different level. and you see the additional cracks within the establishment. I have another video I want to play. It's Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut. Not an anti-imperialist, not anti-war, not pro-Palestine, but representative of a sector within the ruling class that is alarmed that Trump's efforts to create a right-wing political dictatorship, first by repressing Palestinian students or Arab students or students on visas, that's going to lead to a larger sort of creation of a right-wing political dictatorship. Murphy's speaking very clearly about what's at stake. Let's listen to this clip, and then I want to get your thoughts.
A young man by the name of Mahmoud Khalil, an immigrant and a legal permanent resident of the United States, is being held right now in prison, even though no criminal charges have been filed against him. And I want to tell you why that should matter to every single American. Khalil is a recent graduate of Columbia University. He opposed Israel's military operation in Gaza. He has deep animus toward Israel's policies and the U.S. support for those policies. He helped organize the protests over Gaza at his university last year. You can disagree with his views or his politics, but there is no evidence he has broken any law.
This is useful for Mahmoud. Like, number one, we want to get him out of that ICE detention center. We want to get him back with his family. We want him to be a free man. So number one, the more support that is able to be garnered, the better. At the same time, we see these divisions, these fractures within elite ruling class politics. I don't think you would have seen Chris Murphy talking about Palestinian students being repressed during the Biden administration. So he has his own reasons, partly against the right-wing political dictatorship, and partly because Trump is not a Democrat. I mean, it's that narrow. So we're not going to follow Chris Murphy, but we do acknowledge the fact that this is opening up an opportunity for the real left, the anti-imperialist left, to reach a broader section of society.
It's actually kind of amazing, Brian, what it's done to the Democrats. Like Chris Murphy, he's on a completely opposite page than, like you said, he would never have been defending the rights of the student movement for Palestine just 6 months ago, 7 months ago. Now he's put in a completely different position, and he is now publicly defending the right of students to protest against genocide. This is so important, and it actually helps the pro-Palestine movement. With the Trump administration, they were trying with a variety of ways, not just intimidating the student movement, but the way in which they've been dealing with Israel, the way in which they have facilitated the destruction of the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, and they are trying to bully their way into a new agreement or a new reality. The way in which they have gone back to ultra demonizing language for anyone who supports the Palestinian cause. They've been threatening the entire movement since before they came into office. That creates a situation in which we have to, as the movement, not lose what we've gained over the past year and a half. We gained something very significant over the last year and a half. In the fight for Gaza, in the fight against the genocide, millions of people's minds were transformed. Their opinions have changed or have grown in favor of the Palestinian cause. Mass public consciousness has gone further towards the Palestinian cause. Something like 90% of students, was the latest poll I saw, 90% of students on U.S. campuses support Palestine. That is huge. The young generation in particular is in its vast majority going towards Palestine. That is going to change the reality on the ground and change what the White House can or can't do in the future. This is extremely important. Trump wanted to roll all that back. He wanted to demonize the Palestinian movement. He wanted to demonize the protesters. He wanted to make people afraid to support them. Well, now other people in the White House who share many of the same imperialist interests, who have the same imperialist agenda, who have been defending the special relationship with Israel, who have been defending the U.S. role in the genocide, are now forced to defend the pro-Palestine movement. Of course, we're not waiting for them to do that. We're not, going to rely on them for anything, but we're watching it happen. And we have to be able to take the opportunities as they come. We need to now push the pro-Palestine movement to even broader reaches. We can bring more people into the struggle. More people can see that actually standing with Palestine is a good thing. Standing against genocide is a good thing. Standing for people who are being victimized by the billions of dollars that are going towards bombs and military weapons and not going towards schools and not going towards healthcare. This is an obvious choice. It's a natural choice. So I think this is a very major development and something that we really need to analyze closely as a movement.
I couldn't agree more. And again, I think it's worth having both sort of a strategic, tactical, and historical perspective as movement builders, because that's what we are. We're not talking about these things because it's interesting. We're involved as organizers in the movement. Public opinion does matter. Some people on the left say, well, what's the point of having these demonstrations? What's the point of having a change in public opinion because the genocide hasn't stopped? Well, again, for historical perspective, the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era went on for a long time. And I heard that refrain over and over again. What's the point of all of these demonstrations? The war keeps going and going and going. Well, what did actually happen? There was a split finally, as I talked about earlier, within the ruling class. One section of the ruling class thought, no, we have to end this thing. The other thing is the anti-war movement message started to go deeply among American soldiers and sailors and Marines. And there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of kind of small mutinies and some big mutinies by rank and file GIs against the brass. I mean, there were people who were not willing to go back into battle, to take a hill and then be, used as bait so that U.S. could bring in firepower. They didn't want to keep being bait anymore. And so the soldiers stopped fighting. As a matter of fact, they were turning against their officers. Sometimes they were killing their officers. It was called fragging. I mean, there was basically great demoralization within the military. Then you had the mainstream media also starting to promote the message, look, this is an unwinnable war. That changed the political situation. Now, how does it impact the war in Vietnam itself? Well, it wasn't a replacement for the National Liberation Front armies or for their ability to shoot down B-52 bombers. And they shot down 25% of them in the spring of 1972 when they got strategic surface-to-air missiles from the Soviet Union. You can't. That's another arena in a national liberation movement, the battlefield itself. But what Nixon and Kissinger and the war makers couldn't do is they could not escalate. Because if they escalated, popular opinion in the United States was going to make this country explode. And so it becomes a factor, not the decisive factor, but an important factor in struggles for national liberation. The Vietnamese who are fighting for liberation, they nurtured every current in support of anti-war opposition in the U.S., from the most radical students who wore crash helmets to protests because they were anticipating a clash, to clergy members who were having, pacifist sermons on Sunday or Saturday. It didn't matter. The Vietnamese were like, yes, it's all good. For the Palestinian people, I also think we have to keep going with this thing. We have to divest and have sanctions and have protests and have things happen all over society, because ultimately, when the United States feels that Israel is a liability, the Palestinian people's own resilience and steadfast will function in a way that will make the Zionist project actually impossible to continue. This is a long-term national liberation movement, and for those of us in the movement, we have to have a full appreciation. We have to keep going. We have to be steadfast. We also have to appreciate the sort of nuances that are obviously now present in the solidarity movement.
One of the things that we had been repeating to ourselves and to everyone who we were meeting in the movement over the past year and a half, actually from the beginning of this wave of the movement for Palestine, was that this is going to be a long struggle. Not a long struggle in like centuries. We actually think that the liberation of Palestine is real, that it's something that can happen, that it's something that should happen, and it's actually something that we can fight for. This is a realistic horizon. We want to make this happen, and we're not just, putting our wishes into the air. But that it is going to be a long struggle in the fact that we're going to have to navigate many different conditions, many different political moments, many different ups and downs. There's going to be small victories and small setbacks. There's going to be many different kinds of things that we have to do. We have to be able to speak to politicians. We have to be able to organize mass protests. We have to be able to hold educationals. We have to be able to engage with the media. There's so many. We have to be able to develop art and culture that brings the Palestinian cause to the hearts of people, not just the minds of the population. We have to do many different things, and we have to do it for a long period. What we're seeing now is that we have the movement for Palestine is really not tired. It's not going away. When is the last time since Vietnam or the Iraq invasion? Actually, you could tell me better, Brian, but when is the last time that a mass movement in the United States has persisted for more than 18 months? Usually the capitalists can break a mass movement very quickly because they put everything towards it. Well, they've been throwing everything at this mass movement in Palestine, including trying to deport its leaders. And it's actually still growing broader, growing stronger, and bringing people who are personally farther away from the Palestinian cause. It's not just Arabs and Palestinians that you see on the streets. It's people from all walks of life, all different kinds of employment, all different communities, people they really feel unified by the Palestinian cause.
I want to play one last clip, and then we're almost done because we're moving to the finish line. But this is Mike Johnson. He's the leader of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, Speaker of the House. Anyway, I want to play this clip, and then I want to say a few things and get you your last final thoughts.
If you're on a student visa, I'm going to say this clearly. If you are on a student visa and you're in America and you're an aspiring young terrorist who wants to prey upon your Jewish classmates, you're going home. We're going to arrest your tail and we're going to send you home where you belong. And this is just getting started. So
this guy is a real character, Michael Johnson. He was whining earlier in that same interview about how scared he felt when he came to Columbia University during the encampments. But how can Mahmoud get a fair hearing in the United States when you have the Speaker of the House calling him an aspiring terrorist? And what's the basis of his using that characterization, aspiring terrorist? It's because Mahmoud spoke out. He's a good speaker. He's an eloquent speaker in support of the Palestinian people, against the genocide in Gaza, in support of the encampments. What is this? What is terrorism here? The Palestinians, including Mahmoud, are not terrorists. The Palestinians want an end to an injustice. They want to be able to have their homelands back. I asked Miko Peled, who was the son of an Israeli general, a very prominent Israeli general, who is now an activist in support of Palestine. He is also a wonderful author, and he's been a guest on the show. I said, what's the future of Israel look like? What will happen to the Zionist colonial project? And he said, well, there's really two choices. You either have apartheid or you have democracy. Democracy meaning where Muslims, Christians, Jews live together as they historically lived together at peace, but where there wasn't one people who were the chosen people and could deprive the other people of their rights. In other words, one state solution, an anti-apartheid state, a non-apartheid state. Mike Johnson says people who want that are terrorists. It's actually, the terrorists are in Tel Aviv. The terrorists are in Washington, D.C., giving 2,000-pound bombs to the terrorists in Tel Aviv to drop on civilians in Gaza. This is Alice in Wonderland, reality turned upside down. But again, I think Miko Peled is right. I think Mahmoud Khalil is right. What people are fighting for is not some terrorist vision, but a free Palestine, which means a Palestine free of apartheid. Anyway, I'll give you the last word.
The White House and Tel Aviv are attempting to completely invert all these definitions. They want to say that the genocide is self-defense. They want to say that being an anti-racist, anti-genocide protester, organizer, is to be anti-Semitic. They want to say that to stand up against genocide is terrorism, and to carry out a genocide is defense. All these things, they want to basically change how we think of right and wrong. But that is not going to happen. We can't let that happen. We also can't let them set the terms. If you look at some of the right-wing media, you look at what Trump is saying, you look at what Marco Rubio is saying, you look at the conservative, the ultra-right take on this, their attempt, that what they're trying to do is say, Mahmoud is a danger to national security because he's pro-Hamas. They're basically equating being pro-Palestine with they're trying to scare people into saying, well, Hamas is terrorist, and so if you're for Palestine, you're for terrorism. We can't let them reframe reality like this. We need to actually put reality back on the table. And that's what the mass movement for Palestine is doing. When people ask, some of the reporters asked, well, why are you out here at the protest today? Some of the reporters asked, why are you out here? Aren't you scared? Aren't you scared that you too coming out here are going to be called pro-Hamas? Don't you think you're walking a thin line here? Mm-hmm. And that's actually not the reality. We have to tell everybody, the line is actually very clear. The line is not a thin line. It has nothing to do with whether you're pro-Hamas or not. The line has to do with whether you're pro-genocide or not. And it's a very clear line in the sand. We drew that line as the mass movement over a year and a half ago. And that's how history is going to remember it too. On which side did you stand? Did you stand for the genocide or did you stand against the genocide? Now, Mahmoud Khalil is someone who stood against the genocide. The majority of people across the world will also stand against genocide. We need to make sure that everybody sees that line very clearly. And we also need to make sure that we don't let up the fight for Mahmoud's release, because we will not let the Trump administration set those terms as precedent or change those definitions. We know actually what's right and wrong.
All right, we're going to leave it there. And you're either pro-genocide or anti-genocide. Don't be a bystander in the face of genocide. If you're a bystander, you're not an innocent bystander, because everyone can see that this is an actual genocide. Millions of people, Layan, are in the streets. Millions more are going to come into the streets. This struggle is going to continue until there is a free Palestine. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks so much for having me.